Today, you, my friend, are getting some baked takes. That's right. In keeping with the theme of today's video, I thought that I would embrace the hippie stereotype. I don't really have much hippie clothing, so this is my fit. But my hair, it's straightened, I got a middle part, I think I'm still selling the dream. Today we're talking about horror movies from the 1970s. I'll be ranking all the ones that I watched and really diving into the top 10. However, before we do that, I want to get into some of the stuff that I learned about horror movies from the 1970s. From what I gather, the 70s was a more serious decade of horror. Trends ebb and flow. I feel like the 60s was a little bit more of a fun time. You had William Castle, who was just consistently releasing bangers. Then the 70s shifted and had a lot more psychological horror. And then there was the birth of the slasher, so you had Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Black Christmas. Back in the day, slashers had a much more serious tone. Plus, there was a lot of religion-based horror, like The Exorcist and Alice Sweet Alice. There were crazy, suspenseful creature features like Jaws and Alien. There were some splashes of fun and color when you had the rise of the giallo film. You guys, this is embarrassing. I didn't realize until just now as I'm editing that I completely forgot to talk about these two movies in this video, even though I've seen them. So they're not included in my ranking. I'm really sorry, but I will pop back in later and I'll let you know where they would actually fall within my ranking. So stick around, I will talk about these movies, I'm sorry. But color and fun did not become a mainstream trend in the 70s. Of course, the 80s was an explosion of fun. You had a lot of really crazy, colorful, practical gore. There were also a lot of zany, fun villains that you would actually root for. The 90s became more serious again. You had Seven, The Blair Witch Project, Silence of the Lambs. Things got wacky and fun again in the early 2000s when slashers actually were on the rise yet again, although it was mostly remakes of classic movies. In the 2010s, things became a lot more serious. You had the absolute dominance of James Wan with Insidious and The Conjuring, and now I feel the goofies slowly creeping back in. Did you guys see Black Friday? It was a great film. And I'm a fan of every flavor. Give me a fun flick, give me a serious movie. I love them all. That being said though, I don't really feel a strong pull to the 70s. It's not one of my favorite decades thus far. Even though psychological horror is probably my favorite subgenre of horror, it's one of the only ones that still scares me. However, when it comes to 70s psychological horror, a lot of it is trying really hard, but it doesn't make sense. They seem to rely on the confusion of the viewer in the hopes that that will make them scared. Perhaps there is some merit to doing that, and I think even some modern movies do that. Like if you guys have seen A Cure for Wellness, whoa. So many 70s movies will just defy logic in an attempt to be unsettling, but then it kind of just takes me out of what would otherwise maybe be a good plot. Phantasm and Let's Scare Jessica to Death have been the most prime examples of this so far. And it's not in the sense where, oh, I'm confused and compelled, but the ending cleared things up for me, like with Hereditary. At least that movie has a satisfying finale, even if it does beg 1,000 more questions than you had before. It's also not in the sense where I'm like, oh, I think I know what they were going for, it just didn't really work. Because I promise you, a lot of these movies just make no goddamn sense. So there were kind of a disappointing amount of 70s movies that didn't really click with me, but that does not mean that we don't have a very strong top 10 today, and I'm excited to get into it. So without further ado, let's begin my ranking of every 70s horror movie that I think I've seen. I'm pretty sure I have them all accounted for. I'll be ranking 22 movies today. The way I was so confident too. How embarrassing. But to save a little time, I'm only really gonna get into my top 10, like reading the synopses, getting into my more detailed thoughts. So don't worry, we won't be here all day. Coming in at number 22 would be Eraserhead. I understand that David Lynch is some kind of genius. We actually studied him when I was in school because we were learning about experimental film. He's very famous in that genre. So Eraserhead had a lot of those very experimental vibes going on, and I just don't think I had the energy for it that day. It was too much going on that just had me sitting there like, just a mask of utter confusion. I'd really have to get myself into the zone to watch that movie because I think I only made it like 20 minutes in. That was the only movie on this entire list that I couldn't finish, so maybe someday I shall return, although I don't think that's likely. So I'm gonna move on to 21, which would be Alice Sweet Alice. This is one of those religious movies, and I don't really vibe with it. I don't have a Catholic background, so I think it's just one of those things that's really not gonna hit me the same way it'll hit a lot of people. Also, it's really slow, so, but mostly because I was not interested in the plot. So number 20 would be Let's Scare Jessica to Death. This movie had a promising start and I was actually quite interested in it, but then it just became so confusing to the point where I became bored. I just feel like you have to give the audience something. Like, I was not having a good time and things didn't really get cleared up for me. I also got what they were going for with the whole released mental patient thing. Back then there was a way bigger stigma on like mental illness. Although let's be real, there still is, but that kind of a movie probably wouldn't be made today. So that also might be why the movie didn't work for me, because it's coming at mental illness from a very exploitative angle. But you can't really blame a movie for just being a product of its time. It just, you know, isn't for me. Up next at number 19 would be Phantasm. This was a really weird movie. I made the mistake of watching this movie completely sober because it's one of those movies, and this would happen a lot more often than you'd think, where it would make more sense if you were stoned. I think I would have been able to zone into it a little bit better and actually know what was going on, because I watched the whole movie front to back. It was very entertaining, so I rarely looked at my phone or anything, but still at the end of it, I was like, do I even know what just happened? I think the answer is no. So that one's kind of a hard pass for me if I'm sober, and I don't really feel the need to watch it again. Although it did spawn this whole franchise, so like, what's up with that? From what I understand, people just really like The Tall Man. Is that what he's called? Is he the tall man? He's some kind of man and he's really spooky, so I guess maybe he was like the driving force of the franchise. Because the story was weird. I didn't think it was very good. At number 18 would be The Town That Dreaded Sundown. So the quality of this movie was good. It was an interesting and different movie because it was partially narrated as if it was a documentary kind of, but you can't just have a guy running around in plain clothes with a bag on his head and expect me to take that seriously. Come on now, look at this guy. I was cracking up. So it was an interesting movie. It now has me intrigued to watch the remake. I'm hoping that it won't really be in the documentary style and maybe the baghead guy will be a little bit more frightening. I don't know how they got away with that look in Friday the 13th Part 2, but do you remember Baghead Jason? Are you a new horror fan? Have you not explored that whole franchise yet? Yeah, he didn't always have his hockey mask. He looked like this at one point. So with a lot of the parts of the movie that were meant to be frightening, I was kind of just sitting there like, you can't blame me for what I find funny. Coming in at number 17, this is going to anger a lot of people, and that would be Black Christmas. This is one of the most famous movies of the 1970s, probably. Also probably the most famous 70s horror Christmas movie. I don't know what it is that everyone else is on, but can I have some? Because this movie is so boring to me. I'm sorry to be harsh, this movie obviously deserves the credit that it has. You can see a lot of ways that it actually inspired Halloween, particularly with the cinematography, which is what I think Halloween is so iconic for, but it is really dull. And please don't blame the movie's age for it being a slow burn or it not having as obvious of horror elements or anything like that, because you know what else came out in the same year? Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but we'll talk about that later. I am gonna be rewatching it soon. I have seen the movie twice in the past, and the last time was about a year ago, and usually upon a rewatch I can appreciate more things about the movie if I go in kind of knowing what to expect, so I notice new things. So I'm hoping I will like it more this next time around. I'm actually going to be covering it and its two remakes on Christmas Day. We're doing another little original versus remake comparison video. If you're new here, I have already done Halloween, Friday the 13th, I did Halloween 2 and Halloween Kills, I did The Thing, I did 13 Ghosts. There's a lot of really good ones out there in that series now. So subscribe if you're interested to see me compare all the Black Christmas movies. But anyway, so I normally love a good slow burn. I'm a fan of a lot of other 70s movies, but with this movie, for some reason, I never make it past the first act without my eyes glazing over. I don't know why, I just don't care about the characters or the storyline really at all with Black Christmas, so that's why she's all the way down here. Coming in at number 16 would be Deranged. This movie is inspired very closely by the life of Ed Gein. This is also a movie that you wouldn't really be able to get away with making these days, I don't think, because today's serial killer biopics are often told more so from the victim's perspective. Like that one Zac Efron Netflix movie with the ridiculous name, disgustingly shockingly vile, disturbingly evil, shockingly, extremely wicked, I have to look it up now, it's gonna bother me. Extremely wicked, shockingly vile, and evil. Who signed off on the name of that? Why did I even start talking about that? Oh, Deranged. I really liked the movie, but it was married just a bit too closely to the real life of Ed Gein and what really happened. So it's disturbing because a lot of the movie, you're really in his perspective. There's just something really off about that because there were real victims of this person, but now it's sort of like the more that we tell these people's stories like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, it's kind of like mythologizing them, you know, and then it becomes hard for people to remember that there were real victims of these people. These days, there definitely seems to be a priority more of putting the victim stories front and center. So all that to say, this is a very disturbing movie. I think it is an effective horror movie for sure. Knowing how closely related it is to the real life of Ed Gein, it makes it worse, honestly. But for other people who enjoy being scared by that kind of thing, then maybe that's a good thing? I don't know. I'm gonna move on now to my number 15, and that would go to Carrie. With Carrie, what can I say? I've already done a deep dive into this movie and its two remakes, so I don't really know how much more I can say. I appreciate the movie a lot more, but it's just a tough watch for me. Sissy Spacek is a queen. I love to watch her performance, but it's just hard because for majority of the movie, she's like basically being tortured. With horror, I want to feel bad, but in a good way. And Carrie just kind of makes me feel bad in a sad way. Moving on to number 14, that would be The Omen. Another religion-based horror movie. They just don't click with me. And Gregory Peck is the boy, one of my favorite romantic leads in movie history. Roman Holiday, learn about it, but he could not save this film for me. It was a really interesting premise. I did enjoy the story, I think, but again, it was just a bit too long. I don't know what some of these 70s movies were doing being 2 hours long, but I guess that's another thing to note. I feel like the 70s is when movies started becoming so long. Why? Why change a good thing? The 60s had a lot of fabulous, fun, short movies. I love a good short movie. But The Omen is too long. I really enjoyed the first 25 minutes and then the last 20 minutes. In the middle, I really wasn't all there, to be honest. But I really liked the story, so I'm interested to see what they did in the remake. With a lot of these movies, actually, now I'm really interested to see their remakes. But yeah, this one just was not it. I think religious horror is just never really gonna be my cup of tea. Number 13 would be Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I know this is technically not horror. However, I do like to include sci-fi on these lists, and I feel like with Close Encounters, there were some little spooky magooky elements. And while I was watching it, I couldn't help but think about Signs. I feel like Signs had some elements that were heavily inspired by this movie. It's also one of Steven Spielberg's best known alien movies, but definitely not my favorite. This movie had so much going for it. Like, I was really interested in the premise and all the stuff that was happening. The unfortunate thing though is I really hated the lead. I thought that he was super unlikable, and it was really interesting to see Richard Dreyfuss go to being that guy, because before he did this, he was that guy. He was, you know, the scientist in Jaws. It's a weird movie, but it does have this kind of nice theme about the unknown and of discovery. The only problem really is just I hate the vessel through which we learn these things. I hate the main character. So moving on to number 12, that would be the Rocky Horror Picture Show. This one is also pretty light on the horror because it is a very fun musical, but it is kind of an uncomfortable watch because you have Tim Curry, who is a cis heterosexual man that's playing a transgender person. Still to this day, people who are trans have pretty marginal control over how they're represented in mainstream media. So again, we have a movie that's very much a product of its time, but definitely uncomfortable to watch in retrospect as a modern audience member. The terminology in the movie is also really outdated and it's just kind of cringy. If you guys aren't aware about transgender stereotypes or just like gay stereotypes in general, back in the day, shall we say, they were still represented on screen, but as very harsh stereotypes. This would usually include them either being violent or being very sexually aggressive, and in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Tim Curry's character kind of represents all those things. So that's why it's a little bit hard for me to watch. I'm just like, ugh, God, the boomer generation is so cringy. We still love you, you didn't know any better. Anyways, moving on to number 11, that would be the Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake. This would have made it higher up on my list had it been an original movie, but because I grew up on the original from the 50s and that's one of my favorite horror movies of all time, I was bound to not appreciate this movie as much as everyone else. Something that I really liked though was the practical effects. They look look crazy amazing ahead of their time for a 70s movie, but that was really the only enhancement that I noticed. Everything else about the movie felt so similar to the original. All the story beats were exactly the same, except there's kind of like a twist ending. And so I was just kind of bored because I feel like they did have a really good opportunity and they seized on part of it with the practical effects, but they didn't really push it beyond that. So I was just kind of let down. I'm just gonna pop in here to say that actually neither Deep Red or Suspiria made my top 10. I think they would hover pretty close to it though. They're really visually enjoyable movies, but I don't think that the giallo is necessarily the style for me. We'll see though. Definitely want to give Suspiria a retry someday because I want to do a comparison of the original to the remake. Are you guys ready now for my top 10 list, my top 10 horror movies of the 1970s? So, coming in at number 10 would be The Exorcist. When young Reagan starts acting odd, levitating, speaking in tongues, her worried mother seeks medical help. A local priest, however, thinks the girl may be seized by the devil. The priest makes a request to perform an exorcism, and the church sends in an expert to help with the difficult job. A lot of my longtime subs are gonna have their shit rocked by hearing me put this on a top 10 list, but it's not here for the reasons you think, okay? If you're new here, by the way, I should catch you up. Me and my dad tried to watch The Exorcist for the first time about a year ago, and we hated it. I thought it was super cheesy, overhyped nonsense, and my dad thought the exact same. So that's where my opinion has been at on this channel for the past year. However, I decided to watch this movie again because I was diving back into 1970s horror, and this time I had a complete perspective shift on my enjoyment of the movie because this time I pretended that I was watching a comedy. You can't tell me that this isn't hilarious. Please, just for the love of God, watch this. Like, come on. But also, the second time I watched it, I noticed this kind of anti-religious theme, which I did not pick up on the first time around. But let's look at the material. One of the main characters is a priest who seemingly doesn't really believe in exorcisms. He's a very dynamic character with a mixed past who doesn't seem fully committed to his beliefs. He's actually a proponent of science, which back in the 70s, to have a priest character that was like, yeah, more often than not, the patient is just mentally ill, you know, it's not usually a demon. And he was also reluctant to help this mother who seemed convinced that her daughter was possessed. Spoilers coming up, by the way, but this movie's old as shit. Then we bring in an actual Catholic priest to do the exorcism, and he's all like, the power of Christ compels you, and she's like, yeah, well, it's not that compelling. And then it becomes too much for him, and he dies. This man did not even make a dent. He did nothing. The only reason we got a resolution is because the other guy was like, fuck it, take me, dude, not this little girl, take me. So then the demon body jumps, and then he jumps out the window. And I was left sitting there thinking, damn, there really is no God to help us with our demons. If that wasn't the intention of the movie, I would be left dumbfounded because that felt clear as day. And now it makes so much more sense to me why people were so terrified of this movie back in the day, because religion was a lot more prominent and society just kind of accepted a lot of Catholicism-based values. So to see a movie that more or less said, fuck you and your God, you need to deal with your bullshit instead of sitting there and praying about it every night. I mean, what a revelation. So yes, The Exorcist has made its way onto my top 10 list as one of my favorite dark comedies of the 70s. Up next would be a movie called Silent Night, Bloody Night. This is one of those movies that was very confusing, but I feel like I knew what was going on. An axe killer stalks a lawyer and his girlfriend in a house that used to be an asylum. This movie has a lot of issues, but I kind of just cast those all to the side because the story was that interesting. It was that worth it to sit through a movie of a painfully low quality, but to then see and feel the payoff of the crazy twists that the story took. I don't even really have too many more thoughts about this movie. It's just, it's a lot. It's a lot to process. It's a lot to take in. It kind of requires you to be paying a bit more attention. But the quality of the movie is another thing that makes it feel very eerie. It's very gritty. I don't know how to explain my feelings for this movie. I just think that you should watch it. At number 8 would be the Amityville Horror. A family is terrorized by supernatural forces when they move into a new house in New York State. It was the scene of a recent mass killing and the home of an 18th century Satanist. This could have made it higher up on my list, but it did have some issues. It ends very abruptly, and before that, in the 2-hour runtime, there's not a lot of story, like not too much happens, you're just kind of chilling with this very unfortunate family for about 2 hours. But there are effects and horror elements that really hold up in my opinion that I think are really timeless. I was literally squirming during every scene in which the flies were used as a horror element. I hate flies. I absolutely despise them, and gnats and mosquitoes. They feel so dirty to me. Like I freak out whenever they get in my personal space or they land on my food. So this movie did good things for me. It was definitely worth seeing as one of the first haunted house movies, and I feel like it has a unique and darker story than a lot more haunted house movies that I've seen. Coming in at number 7 would be The Stepford Wives. Joanna Eberhardt moves to the quiet town of Stepford with her husband and children. The town seems perfect, maybe a little too perfect. There's something not quite right with the suburbs women. They're vapid, unfathomably devoted to housework, and completely subservient to their husbands. The Stepford Wives messed me up. When this movie came out, the country was in one of the biggest waves of feminism that the country had seen since they, decided to let us vote. And it's about the horrors of living in suburbia as a housewife. You had Halloween, which took horror into suburbia, but this movie was making suburbia the horror itself. That's one of the most interesting and frightening concepts. They also did this in season 3 of You, that suburbia looks great, everyone puts on this front and seems so happy with their perfect little families, but in reality, it can feel like a trap to a lot of people. And in Stepford Wives, it's specifically the women that feel trapped. Their only role was to be the wife or the mother, and they didn't really have many freedoms to pursue a life beyond that. The pay gap was huge, still exists by the way. There was hiring discrimination, etc. So at this time, being a housewife was still the only option for a lot of women. That definitely disproportionately affects women of color, but this movie of course doesn't get into that. This is more of like a white feminism movie, but it still does throw you some really good food for thought. And there's a twist. There's like a very nasty twist, but don't watch the trailer, please. Please go in blind, because I think it's something that would be so shocking and so fun on your first viewing. Well, not fun, like it's horrifying. This movie messed me up, like I said, and the movie is definitely worth watching to find out what that twist is, so I'm not going to talk about it. Coming in at number 6, something a little more lighthearted, would be Piranha. When thousands of military hybrid piranhas are accidentally released into a river used by a children's holiday camp, the race is on to get downstream before the flesh-eating fish do. This is the Jaws knockoff that not enough people talk about. The movie opening is so similar to Jaws, and then the rest of it pretty much follows the same structure. Instead of calling it Piranha, you can kind of just call it B-movie Jaws, because that's what it is. It's so much fun. The practical effects are very silly. It's a lot gorier than Jaws as well. You also get to see a lot of 70s style featured in the movie, which is amazing because that's like my favorite decade of fashion. It's not a deep nor complex movie, it's just a good time. I now positively must see the 2010 remake, because an early thousands remake of this movie, are you kidding me? Sign me up. So that's on the watch list now. Again, not very deep, so let's move on to number 5, which would be When a Stranger Calls. A young high school student babysits for a very rich family. She begins to receive strange phone calls threatening the children. When she finally realizes that it's not a joke, she calls the police, only to find out that it may be too late. This made it so far up the list because of the opening of this movie alone. It would have been higher up on the list if the first 20 minutes weren't the best 20 minutes of the whole movie, because even knowing the famous twist, I was still floored. The suspense is actually really high when you know the twist, because you have this critical information that this babysitter doesn't have. It's very dark and very compelling, although I kind of just wish that the opening 20 minutes was like a short film, and that was it. I didn't care that much about the plot of the antagonist, and yet we followed their storyline and their perspective for a good amount of the movie. I much prefer the development of my protagonists because it helps me to get into their mind and their perspective and feel for them a bit more when they get attacked or whatever. But even so, there's so much suspense in this movie. I genuinely felt scared too, and the climax of the movie is very unnerving, not just the opening. This is another one where I need to watch the remake soon because I want to see how badly they butchered it, or maybe there's the off chance that they did something cool. Time will tell. Moving on. We're getting into my top 4 favorite horror movies of the 1970s, and here's where the list is gonna start to be pretty predictable. So don't worry, I won't talk your ear off about these movies because you probably know them well, and coming in at number 4 would be The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I've already covered this movie and the franchise pretty extensively. I also recently did a Texas Chainsaw remake versus original comparison, where I also extensively covered the remake. This movie is so rich in in its detail, so thick with atmosphere, and it's just dripping in 70s style, both very much a product of its time and kind of ahead of its time. But like I said, you guys know that I love that movie, and from here on out, all my picks are very predictable, so moving on. Coming in at number 3 would be Halloween from 1978. Yet again, I've covered this movie so very extensively on this channel. I reviewed the entire franchise. I did a comparison video of the original to the 2007 remake. I did another comparison of the original to the 2018 reboot. And like I said, I did Halloween 2 versus Halloween Kills. This is my warm blanket movie. It just makes me feel so warm and cozy. One that I'll forever rewatch and study and appreciate the ways that it shaped my favorite genre. So coming in at number 2, that would be Jaws. Again, what can I say that hasn't been said? I have a little bit more of a bias and a leaning towards this movie because I grew up on it. It was probably the first horror movie that I ever saw that wasn't like a 50s sci-fi movie. Like, they started me young on Jaws. By they, I mean my father and my grandfather. This is another highly rewatchable one, also has some great action, just a great summertime blockbuster, and it makes you scared of the ocean every single time. I also put this movie on my top 10 horror movie openings of all time. I have a lot of love for Jaws. But what is number 1, you might be asking? Or you might not be because you've been around and you know me well, so you know that I'm about to say that Alien comes in at number 1. This is a perfect movie to me, so it's so timeless. I don't even care what people have to say about the fact that this futuristic ship is all analog, because maybe that's what we'll revert back to in another 1,000 years. Trends change. I even like that with the production design, it's not super busy with all this high-tech futuristic-y stuff, like what you would see in a Marvel movie, you know, and I love Marvel, obsessed with Marvel, but I think with this movie that definitely would not have its place. It also just allows the true aesthetic of this ship to shine through, which I really love. It's not all dressed up with fancy distractions. And Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, obviously one of my top 10 final girls of all time. The alien itself, its design is so creative and it creates so many obstacles that the whole dynamic of what plays out is always really fun. I don't have too much more to add to this conversation right now because someday I do hope to make another comparison video where I talk about Alien and Predator. I still haven't seen that movie yet, but it stars my boy Arnold, so I'm really excited to do that someday. There's not a super high demand for that right now, but I'm looking forward to it at some point in the future. So let me know if you'd like me to do that, but also while you're making your little comment, let me know your top 10. Or if you don't have a top 10, give me your top 3 or just your favorite horror movie from the 1970s. If there are any that I missed that I didn't watch, definitely recommend me some. But other than that, I must thank my lovely patrons and give them all their kisses. If you would also like my kisses, then definitely sign up for my Patreon linked down below. This week you got some early access for the next part of my Outlast series, which by the way has moved to my vlog channel. But yeah, I'm also hoping as a Christmas gift to my patrons, I might be posting some extra content there later this month. Hard to say though, have a very busy schedule coming up with all my content. So just stay tuned, stay tuned. Hope you enjoyed the video, stay groovy, I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!